On the theme of Thanksgiving, we've spent 3 weeks talking about Thanksgiving. The first week, 2 weeks ago, we talked about giving thanks for the past, for all of those that what the writer of Hebrews calls the great cloud of saints who brought us to this place and to whom we owe a great deal. Last week, we talked about the daily blessings of life that we oftentimes don't see or acknowledge, but how important they are. And today, I want to talk about what is a more difficult subject, and that is giving thanks in all circumstances. It's easy to give thanks when life is going well. It's difficult and challenging to give thanks in all circumstances. So I'm going to ask you to turn with me to Paul's. We're not going to read as far through as I put in the bulletin. Paul's letter to the church at Thessalonica. This is the 5th chapter, beginning with verse 12. And I'll point out the verse we're going to be talking about, but this is wonderful advice he gives to the members. He says, "But we appeal to you, brothers and sisters, to respect those who labor among you and have charge of you in the Lord and who admonish you. Esteem them very highly in love because of their work. Be at peace among yourselves. And we urge you, beloved, to admonish the idlers, encourage the faint-hearted, help the weak, be patient with all of them. See that none of you repays evil for evil, but always seek to do good to one another and to all. Rejoice always." Now here's this phrase that we're going to be preaching about this. It's really wonderful. "Pray without ceasing. Give thanks in all circumstances, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. This past week, my wife Bobby and I went over to Denton to our third grade grandson's school in Denton and had a Thanksgiving feast. There's history here. I don't know exactly how it happened, but I think when Liam was in the first grade, he ended up telling his teacher that his grandmother Baba was a really, really good cook and that he was sure that Baba and Dee Dee would come over and serve a Thanksgiving feast to his class. And she took him up on it. And so we did that 2 years ago, and then I think she passed the good news on to the second grade teacher, and now the second grade teacher has passed it on to the third grade teacher. It's something we love doing. It's really, really fun. This year, Liam has 26 kids in his class. I think Bobby brought a 23-pound turkey that she had cooked, and they ate every bite of it. I mean, there was nothing but bones left. All I do is carve it, and it's just really, really a lot of fun. But I noticed as I was walking through the halls of the classroom that they still teach Thanksgiving the way they taught it when I was in grade school. There were kids, of course, some of whom were decorated in other grades, had worn costumes. There were these pictures on the wall of Native Americans in costumes, and of course the pilgrims with their pilgrim hats. There was a mural that depicted a wonderful feast, the first Thanksgiving. And of course, that's the way a lot of people think of that first Thanksgiving. It had been a great year. The pilgrims had lots of good crops. They had so much food. They invited the Native Americans. They sat down and set a big table like we do at Thanksgiving and had a wonderful feast. The reality, which I sometimes remind you of on this particular day, is that in the fall of 1621, as the original pilgrims sank to their knees to give thanks, 1/2 of them had died in the previous year. 1/2 of them. In the background, the crosses of those loved ones whom they had buried. There were 7 times more crosses than there were huts in which they lived. The truth of the matter is that no people have ever been on American soil that were hungrier or more impoverished than they. And yet, as they brought in the meager and disappointing crops of that fall, these were God-believing, Bible-reading Christians, and they did exactly what Paul told them to do. In all circumstances, give thanks. And so with the graves of their loved ones behind them, they sank to their knees and they gave thanks to God. What does it mean to give thanks in all circumstances? I don't know how it is with your life today, but maybe we could ask this question this way. What would it mean today to say, if you're a citizen of Paris, France, to say, let's give thanks in all circumstances, or a citizen of Belgium or Lebanon? What would it mean if you were a citizen of Russia, had lost one of those family members on that plane? You may not like Vladimir Putin. I don't much care for him myself. But what would it mean to be a Russian who's lost a loved one today and hear the words, give thanks in all circumstances? What would it mean today if you lived in Nigeria or Syria, or maybe someplace halfway between war and safety? What would it mean to hear the words, in all circumstances, give thanks? I have an expression, it goes like this. If things are really going well and something good happens to you, that's not really giving thanks, that's just good manners. If somebody opens the door for you, or somebody provides you really good customer service at your retail store and you say thanks, that's just good manners. If you're a farmer and the crops have been really abundant this year and you say thanks, that's just good manners. If you received a promotion recently, or you're going to get an end of the year bonus and you say thanks, that's just good manners. Thanksgiving is what takes place. True thanksgiving is what takes place in the midst of all of the messiness of life, and sometimes the tragedies of life, and it's what lies at the very heart of our proclamation of the gospel. The last several weeks, Denise and I have buried 2 children, members of Christ Church. We've come to this place to say goodbye to children. What does it mean in those circumstances to fall to your knees and say, thanks be to God, thanks be to God? It turns out that St. Paul is somewhat of an expert on this issue of all circumstances. When you read through the New Testament, to his letters to the churches, what you discover is that St. Paul led a really, really tough life. I've been reading it for years, and honestly, when you read through there, it's hard to find much fun or joy in Paul's life. I don't know, maybe there was some. Maybe he just kind of felt sorry for himself, and so he constantly wrote about the bad things that happened. But we know this much: Paul was beaten on several different occasions. He was thrown in jail, imprisoned on different occasions, spent a lot of time in prison. That doesn't sound like much fun to me. Only twice I think he was shipwrecked. He must have been a really good swimmer. Paul led a really, really difficult life. And yet he said, I guess he had learned it through his own difficult, trying experiences. He said, and I think it lies at the heart of the gospel, he says, in all circumstances, give thanks. That's a phrase that you can remember, and it's worth remembering, because the time will come when it'll have a lot of value for you. Now, in all circumstances, I must go to my knees and give thanks. It's closely related to another phrase that Paul offers us in his second letter to the Corinthians. It's an amazing phrase. He says, when I am weak, I am strong. Now there is a contradictory statement for you. When I am weak, I am strong. What do you suppose Paul was saying when he said, when I am weak, I am strong? Here's what I think he was saying. He says, when I am weak, I am strong, because it is at that point that I meet God most clearly in my life. Look, you and I really don't like talking about this or acknowledging or admitting it, but this is just as true as you can get. We never meet God more powerfully than at the point of our pain. It is at the point of our pain, not when we've gone to our knees, but when we've been driven to our knees, where God becomes most powerfully present in our lives. And I think that's what Paul was saying. He had been driven to his knees on a lot of occasions. I think that's what he was saying. When I am weak, when I've been driven to my knees, that's when I'm the strongest, because that's when I turn to God. That's the moment when God becomes the foundation and the fortress for my life. I was thinking about that this past week. I was working on this sermon. I thought, God becoming the fortress in our life. I thought about that hymn we sing often in church. A mighty fortress is my God. It's on page 110 of your hymnal, I think. We love to sing it. It's a wonderful hymn written by Martin Luther. A mighty fortress is our God, a bulwark never failing. And if we were to sing it today, we'd stand and we'd sing it at the top of our lungs. It's a wonderful, a mighty fortress is our good God, a bulwark never failing. And yet most of us don't really believe it, do we? The truth of the matter is, we don't spend very much time making God the fortress of our lives, because we spend most of our time trying to make our own lives into a fortress. I'll just speak for myself here. And be as honest as I possibly can. If I could do it, I would. If I could cut God out of my life, I would. I don't like being dependent on God. I'm not always trusting of God. The truth of the matter is, if I could make a fortress out of my own life, I would. If I could construct and build my life in such a way that I knew that I could protect my children and my grandchildren, if I knew that I could have security for myself and the members of my family, if I knew that I had some kind of control over the future of my life, if I could, I would leave God out of it totally. I would make a fortress out of my life. And so would you, unless you're a saint, and you're not. So would you, if you're honest about it. It is only when we've driven to the point of pain, when we've been driven to our knees, that we truly discover the power of God's presence in our lives. It is at that point that we understand what it means to say, in all circumstances, I give thanks. The Bible has a lot of wonderful stories in it, but maybe the greatest of all is a story that Luke tells, and it illustrates this point. This story is such a great story that it illustrates almost all of the great truths of the Bible. You could preach it over and over again, but this time I want to tell it from the perspective of the younger brother, the story of the prodigal son. Some of you know the story at least. It's a father, he's a wealthy father, he's a big farmer, rancher, he had lots of money, lots of land, lots of livestock. The elder brother was a typical elder brother. He was the good brother, he worked hard, he was faithful, he was loyal, he was trustworthy. He was there working from night to day. The father always knew where he was. He never knew where the younger brother was. He was irresponsible, spontaneous. One day the younger brother comes to the father and he asks the unthinkable. He says, Father, I want you to give my half of the inheritance to me now. It's unthinkable in today's culture, and that culture truly unthinkable. Partly because most of the time the younger brother didn't get anything. The elder brother got it all. But secondly, for any child to go to a father in that culture and say, I'm ready for you to give me my inheritance now, would be the same as saying, Father, I'm ready for you to die now. But he does it. He goes to the father and he says, I want to be on my own. And the father pulls out his checkbook and he writes him a check. And it's a generous check. It's for 1/2 of everything he has. And he hands it to the son. And the boy goes off into what Luke calls the far country. And as long as he has the money, he spends his time and his money for lack of a better phrase, entertaining himself. And we don't know how long it went on, months, maybe years, but sooner or later, as it always does, the money ran out. And the boy found himself literally on his knees, eating the same food as the pigs. And it was at that point that he became strong enough to get up and return to his father, who forgave him and loved him. It is at the point of our greatest pain, when we are the weakest, that we become the strongest. And Paul said, in all circumstances, give thanks. I don't know how it is with you right now. Maybe you came here today and everything's going really well with your life. Frankly, it is. Things are going pretty well with me too. You came here today, really, things are going well with your life. No problems. And you're thinking, wow, I was kind of counting on a little bit more of an upbeat sermon. But it occurs to me that the proclamation which we make every single Sunday, in some ways, is always the same proclamation. It is about the relationship which you have with God. It is about the relationship that I have with God. That and nothing more. The circumstances of life change. They come and go. But the real question is about the relationship that we have with God, whether or not we really are willing to make God the foundation and the fortress in our lives. Paul says that begins this way. In all circumstances, give thanks.